Joining me now is the Nationals leader, David Littleproud. David, thanks so much. Cam's been on this story from the beginning. What's your view on it?
Yeah, well, I think the government's been found out, and YC Lyons would want to go on this trip, considering her strong personal views, tends to point to the fact that it was more about a jaunt than anything else. And the government has just mismanaged this whole issue, and now it's become about politics and about trying to save face. And it started in October 23 on the 8th when that Imam stood on the steps of the Sydney Opera House and spewed hate to those of the Jewish faith after the terrorist attack on Israel. And this is where you needed strong leadership from the start. That's the moment the Prime Minister should have called a national cabinet together to work with the premiers to make sure that there was a very strong message put out from the start around hate permeating in this country. Instead, we are seeing the streets of Sydney and Melbourne burn because of a weak Prime Minister, and now trying to save face on something that is quite important for the world to commemorate, because this is one of our darkest hours, what happened in Auschwitz. And I think the Prime Minister has shown a lack of leadership from the start, and Australians are asking themselves, do they feel better off? But they're also now asking themselves, do they feel safer after 3 years of Anthony Albanese? And the question and the answer to those questions is both no.
Can you fault Chris Minns?
Well, look, I think Chris Minns has shown more leadership than the Prime Minister, and I think it's actually commendable. And when you talk to those of the Jewish faith in New South Wales, they feel supported. They feel supported by a Premier that actually does have the levers to pull with much of on-the-ground policing. And I think that speaks volumes when you have a Prime Minister, but that hasn't pulled the National Cabinet together, bring premiers together, when this is not just a New South Wales problem. This is one that is permeating across the country. And that's why it's important there was national leadership, that you support and you work off what is best practice and make sure that there's national consistency in that strong message that anti-Semitism isn't welcome here, and the hate that permeates in the Middle East should stay there. It shouldn't matter what your race or your religion is in this country. If you want to go and worship in a place of worship or celebrate your faith, it doesn't matter what your religion is in this country, you've got a right to do that in a safe environment. And that's the country I grew up in, and that's the country I'm going to leave behind. And we made it very clear, Peter Dutton and I, that we're going to face into this. We're not going to be weak on this. We're going to send very strong messages about what it is to live in Australia, what it is about respect of one another and their faith and their beliefs. And there's a right way and there's a wrong way, and that wrong way has been allowed to actually spread like a cancer across this country because the Prime Minister hasn't lent into it.
Well, let's talk about Trump 2.0, because this is part of essentially his executive orders that he signed on day one. One of those was, we know what he stands. He's on immigration. He's going to start deporting illegal immigrants. But secondary to that, he's talking about the right to essentially deport people who are not in the national interest or talk about things that are counter to the national interest. Is this something you and Peter Dutton are discussing, following through with in the lead up to our election here?
No, what we've said is that if you're not an Australian citizen, you don't live by our laws, and particularly if you're permeating hate around anti-Semitism or any actual hate around a religious belief, then you have no right to stay. But if you're an Australian citizen, that comes with responsibility, and you need to live up to that. And that's why we've been talking about increased jail times, minimum sentences for those that actually want to ignore that. So there's two classes here. There's an Australian citizen that comes with the rights and responsibilities, but with that comes a penalty if you don't respect that principle of respecting one another's religious beliefs and being able to celebrate that. But those that aren't citizens here, they should be sent home. We shouldn't allow those that want to permeate hate and actually cause discourse in our community and see the streets of our cities burn, allowed to stay here. No government should allow that. You should lean into it and send them home and put them on the next plane. That's the common sense solution.
So you're talking about... Sorry to interrupt you, David. We're starting off the new year as we did at the last. But when you're talking about leaning into that particular issue, are you talking about potential changes in the law, or are you talking about using the existing laws in a more fulsome way?
Yeah, and we'll use what we've got, and if we need to
Okay.
pivot and increase those penalties, we will for those that aren't citizens of Australia. But we've also got to have strong leadership in sending that message to Australian citizens that there is a consequence if you want to disrespect the right of other Australians to worship a faith, no matter what it is. We're not picking a faith here. We're simply saying that every faith should be respected. That's the great country that we've created. That should be respected and protected. And that's what we'll do. And that's what hasn't happened under Anthony Albanese. He's allowed this hate to permeate because he's tried to walk both sides of the fence. And you can't do that. You need strong leadership because Australians should have that right protected. That's what we'll do.
Looking at Trump's re-election, and now he has been inaugurated, and as I say, he's hit the ground running. Has that changed how you might approach things at this election? Do you think it gives corporate Australia perhaps more confidence to pull back on the DEI and the ESG type of things? Is cancel culture less of a threat than it used to be?
Well, I think corporate Australia got a bit of a lesson after The Voice there, and I think in Australia Day we're still seeing some of these corporates trying to appease a minority. You can't change history. Our history is our history. You've got to lean into it, and we should be proud of the fact that while we made mistakes, we've righted those wrongs, and we're better having been together and better sticking together. But corporate Australia got a lesson out of The Voice that they don't determine the moral compass of this country. The Australian Parliament does. Because if we get it wrong, you get rid of us. And if corporate Australia want to go down this path, then ultimately I think Australians are fair people, but ultimately they get to a juncture where they say we've had enough of you. So we'll be very clear that we've all got to get back to our knitting. Their job is to create wealth in this country, to create jobs. It's not to set the moral compass and not to be set by 12 board of directors sitting in a high rise in Sydney and Melbourne that are out of touch with real Australia. They just need to leave that to the Australian Parliament, the Australian people. They need to get back to their core principle and live up to that.
When we have this discussion, we always talk about leaving it to the Parliament as well. But I've got to say, sometimes politicians aren't always the best steerer of the national moral compass either.
Well, that's where there's a safety valve. There's an election every 3 years.
Yeah.
And that's what Australians are asking themselves today. Do they feel better off after 3 years of Anthony Albanese? And will they feel better off and safer if you give him another 3 years? And even his own Treasury is saying you won't. And then when you look at the streets of Sydney and Melbourne burning, I think Australians are overwhelming and look at that and saying, we haven't gone forward, we've gone back. And that safety valve comes in about 3 months' time, that they get to elect a parliament that reflects their aspirations and their fears and about the opportunities and strength of leadership that is offered to them in making sure this country is put back on track.
All right, what about Trump's national executive order of only recognising two sexes, two genders?
Yeah, and I think there's elements of this that come to the core principle of protecting women, and particularly in things like sport. I think, women should be competing against other women. And you think about it, particularly you get to the professional echelons. A young woman puts her heart and soul into it and is trying to get to the top. And then someone of transgender comes across and because is physically stronger, rips away that hard work and that opportunity that's been put in front of them. And I think we just need to take a deep breath on this. It doesn't need to get emotional. We just need to understand that it also comes back to respect. And it comes back to respect about respecting that biological basis that we can't get away from when we're born, and making sure that women in particular, their rights are protected. And I think we can do that in a sensible way without vitriol, without upsetting anyone, but just respecting the fact that there are some changes that I think in our society that we probably need to lean into.
David, great to see you. Happy New Year. Welcome back to AM Agenda.
Good to be with you.